Most drivers think police only start evaluating them after questions begin. That's not how real traffic stops work. The testing starts immediately, before the officer reaches the window, before documents are requested, before a single word is spoken. Here's what most people never realize. Traffic stops are filled with quiet behavioral tests, not formal tests, informal ones. Small moments designed to measure reaction, timing, posture, tone, hesitation, and compliance patterns. And the dangerous part is this. Most drivers never realize they're being evaluated while it's happening. Tonight, I want to show you how these tests actually work. Because from a legal perspective, officers are not simply listening to answers. They are studying behavior. And courts later analyze those behaviors through Bodycam review, timing analysis, and the reasonable officer standard. This is where things change. Because the stop you think is routine may already be turning into something much more serious. Quietly, the core truth. Officers build perception before they build cases. Most people misunderstand how traffic stop investigations develop. They imagine officers looking for one major mistake. In reality, officers build perception incrementally, one observation at a time. A traffic stop is not a conversation. It's a sequence. Every sequence contains behavioral indicators. How quickly you pull over, how long your hands disappear, how you respond to silence, whether your movements match your words. Movement versus words. That phrase matters. Because courts repeatedly rely on physical behavior when evaluating officer decisions later, not just spoken language. Here's what most people miss. The purpose of many officer questions is not necessarily the answer itself. It's the reaction, the timing, the body language, the hesitation, the consistency. That reaction helps officers determine whether the stop remains routine or expands into investigative detention. And once reasonable suspicion begins forming, the legal framework changes rapidly. Tonight, we break down how those hidden tests happen and why most drivers never notice them until it's too late. Move 1. The first 10 seconds are behavioral tests. The first test begins before contact. Most drivers think the stop begins at the window. It doesn't. It begins the second emergency lights activate. From a legal perspective, officers immediately start evaluating driver behavior. How long does it take to pull over? Does the vehicle drift before stopping? Does the driver appear confused, delayed, or frantic? Bodycam and dashcam footage capture all of it. Courts later analyze these first moments closely during suppression hearings and use of force review. Timing matters. A calm, predictable pullover sequence generally communicates cooperation. Abrupt braking, delayed stopping, repeated lane drifting, or sudden interior movement can shift officer perception immediately. Here's a realistic scenario. An officer initiates a stop for speeding. The driver continues driving for nearly 20 seconds before stopping. During that time, the officer observes repeated shoulder movement inside the vehicle. From the driver perspective, they were simply looking for insurance paperwork. From the officer's perspective, uncertainty develops. That uncertainty becomes part of the investigative narrative. Courts later evaluate whether the officer's heightened caution became objectively reasonable based on observable behavior. Notice what happened. No crime escalation occurred yet, but the officer's perception changed. And once perception changes, the tone of the encounter changes with it. This is where things begin shifting. Quietly. Move 2. Hands visibility is one of the biggest hidden tests. Here's what most drivers underestimate. Hands determine officer psychology more than words ever will. Officers are trained constantly around hand awareness. Why? Because hands create capability, not intent. Capability. That distinction matters legally. Courts consistently give officers broad discretion regarding visible hand concerns during traffic stops. This means simple, innocent actions can dramatically alter officer interpretation. Reaching downward, digging through a console, adjusting clothing near the waistline, repeatedly hiding hands below window level. None of these actions are criminal by themselves, but they trigger evaluation. Movement versus words. Again, a driver may say, "I'm just getting my registration." But if the movement appears sudden or unclear on body cam review, the officer's reaction often becomes legally justified under the reasonable officer standard. One realistic case involved the driver repeatedly reaching between the seat and center console before the officer approached. No weapon existed. No contraband existed. But the officer drew additional backup based entirely on movement patterns. The court later upheld the officer's safety concerns because the movements appeared unpredictable and difficult to interpret. Notice the language. Difficult to interpret. That phrase appears constantly in court review because uncertainty itself changes legal justification. This is why officers quietly test hand visibility throughout the stop, not just at the beginning, continuously. Move 3. Silence is often used as a measurement tool. Most people think officer questions exist only to gather information. Sometimes they exist to study silence. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of traffic stops. Officers often ask simple questions while already knowing the answer. Why? Because the response pattern matters more than the content. How far are you headed tonight? Where are you coming from? Do you know why I stopped you? These questions create behavioral opportunities. From a legal perspective, officers evaluate timing, tone, hesitation, and consistency, not just facts. A quick answer may appear rehearsed. A delayed answer may appear calculated. An overly detailed answer may appear defensive. Silence becomes part of the evaluation sequence. Here's what most people miss. Courts later analyze silence alongside physical behavior, not independently. If silence occurs while the driver avoids eye contact, adjusts posture repeatedly, or changes breathing rhythm, officers may interpret those combined factors as indicators of nervousness or concealment. A realistic example. An officer asks a driver whether they consumed alcohol that evening. The driver pauses several seconds before answering. During the pause, body cam footage shows visible swallowing, posture adjustment, and downward gaze. The officer later articulates these observations as indicators contributing to reasonable suspicion for DUI investigation. Courts analyze the totality of circumstances, not isolated moments. This is how routine stops begin expanding, not through dramatic confrontation, through layered interpretation. Move 4. Officers quietly test compliance timing. Most drivers believe compliance is simple. You either comply or you don't. Legally, it's more nuanced. Timing matters. Courts evaluate not only whether instructions were followed, but how quickly and how clearly they were followed. This creates one of the most important hidden tests during traffic stops. Response timing. An officer requests license and registration. The driver delays, not refusing, just delaying. Maybe searching slowly. Maybe asking repeated questions first. Maybe freezing from stress. From the driver's perspective, the behavior feels harmless. From the officer's perspective, uncertainty develops. This matters because investigative detention allows officers to evaluate evolving risk conditions during the stop, and hesitation contributes to that analysis. One realistic scenario involved a driver instructed multiple times to place both hands on the wheel. The driver complied eventually each time, but repeatedly removed one hand while speaking. The officer later described behavior as partial noncompliance and divided attention. The court upheld increased officer control measures based partly on repeated delayed compliance patterns. Here's what most people miss. The legal system often analyzes hesitation differently than ordinary people do. Ordinary people interpret hesitation emotionally. Courts interpret hesitation behaviorally. That distinction changes everything. Because once hesitation begins resembling uncertainty or unpredictability, officer reactions become easier to justify later. Move 5. The seatbelt test almost nobody notices. The seatbelt becomes a behavioral signal during traffic stops, and most drivers never realize it. The timing of when the seatbelt comes off matters enormously. If the driver removes it before the officer approaches, officers may interpret preparation for movement or exit behavior. If the driver delays removing it after instruction, officers may interpret hesitation. Bodycam microphones capture the click clearly. Timing becomes evidence. Courts repeatedly analyze transitional moments during use of force review and compliance disputes. One case focused almost entirely on the timing between the officer's exit instruction and the audible seatbelt release. 3 seconds. That was a dispute. The prosecution argued delayed compliance. The defense argued cautious movement. The court slowed the footage frame by frame. This is where things change, because courts often care less about dramatic moments than transitional ones. The seconds between instruction and action, the moments between silence and movement. The seatbelt becomes part of that behavioral sequence, and officers quietly evaluate those sequences constantly. If this breakdown is changing how you view traffic stops, that's because most people never see these encounters from the courtroom perspective. This channel focuses on what officers document, what body cams capture, and what courts actually analyze later. So if you value understanding how these situations truly work, subscribe and stay with us, because awareness of small details often matters more than people realize. Move 6. Officers test emotional control without saying so. Here's something officers understand very well. Emotional shifts change behavior. That's why many officers intentionally maintain conversational pressure during traffic stops. Not always aggressively. Sometimes subtly. A repeated question. An unexpected pause. Silence after an answer. These moments test emotional stability. Because emotional destabilization often changes movement patterns, speech pacing, and compliance timing. From a legal perspective, courts later evaluate officer reactions partly through observed behavioral escalation. A driver who begins calm but gradually becomes emotionally reactive changes the tone of the stop. One realistic example involved an officer repeatedly asking a driver to clarify travel plans. The questions themselves remained routine, but the driver's frustration increased visibly. Speech sped up, tone sharpened, movements became abrupt. The officer later cited increasing agitation and unpredictable behavior when requesting additional units. The court upheld the officer's actions because the escalation appeared behaviorally reasonable based on evolving observations. Notice again, the questions themselves were not the key factor. The reaction was. That's the hidden test. Move 7. Officers watch whether words match movements. Consistency matters enormously during traffic stops, and officers test for inconsistency constantly. A driver says they understand instructions, but continues interrupting. A driver says they are calm, but repeatedly reaches downward. A driver verbally agrees to comply, but posture suggests hesitation. Movement versus words. Courts often prioritize movement over language during body cam analysis. Why? Because movement is viewed as less controllable and more revealing under stress conditions. This creates one of the most important hidden tests officers perform: behavioral alignment. Do actions align with verbal presentation? One realistic scenario involved a driver who repeatedly insisted they were not nervous. Meanwhile, body cam footage showed visible shaking, repeated clothing adjustment, and rapid speech. The officer interpreted the mismatch as concealment anxiety. That interpretation contributed to expanded questioning. Courts later upheld the officer's developing suspicion based partly on behavioral inconsistency. This is why experienced defense lawyers analyze physical behavior carefully, because courts often rely heavily on observable alignment between statements and conduct. Move 8. The routine question that quietly builds probable cause. Officers frequently ask questions they already know may produce inconsistent answers. Travel plans, destination details, ownership information, timeline clarification. Here's why. Inconsistency creates investigative expansion, not because inconsistency automatically proves wrongdoing, but because inconsistency contributes to reasonable suspicion development. A driver says they're returning from dinner. Moments later mentions leaving work, then changes the timeline slightly again. Minor contradiction. But contradictions accumulate, and accumulation matters legally. Courts repeatedly uphold expanded investigations when officers can articulate layered suspicion based on evolving inconsistencies. That phrase matters. Layered suspicion. Because probable cause rarely appears instantly during traffic stops. It develops incrementally, one detail supporting another. This is why officers test conversational consistency constantly, without directly announcing they are doing so. They are studying whether the narrative remains stable under repeated questioning. And many drivers unknowingly create problems simply by over-explaining. Move 9, investigative detention, quietly expands through testing. Most drivers cannot identify when a stop stops being routine. That confusion creates danger. A routine stop may gradually become investigative detention expansion. Commands increase. Questions deepen. Movement restrictions tighten. Backup arrives. Positioning changes. But often, no one formally announces a shift. This is where officers rely heavily on behavioral testing. Compliance timing, tone, movement predictability, responsiveness. Officer safety assessments expand gradually based on those observations. One realistic case involved a driver initially stopped for equipment violation. The stop later evolved into DUI investigation based partly on behavioral indicators observed during questioning and movement sequencing. The driver believed the stop remained routine the entire time. Legally, the investigative scope had already expanded significantly. This is why understanding officer testing matters, because the legal framework changes quietly. And once reasonable suspicion grows into probable cause, officer authority expands rapidly. Move 10, Bodycam review turns tiny details into major evidence. Drivers remember traffic stops emotionally. Courts analyze them mechanically. This is one of the biggest disconnects in legal interpretation. Bodycam footage removes memory disputes and replaces them with replayable sequence analysis. Courts pause footage, replay commands, study timing gaps, evaluate posture, listen to tone, analyze hand visibility. Tiny details become enormous. One case review focused entirely on breathing changes visible through chest movement during questioning. Another focused on repeated downward glances during silence. Another centered on whether a driver's hands disappear below window level for 2 or 4 seconds. That level of analysis surprises most people, but this is how courts evaluate officer conduct. And this is why officers test behavior continuously during traffic stops, because those tests later become evidence, not formal evidence, behavioral evidence, the kind that shapes reasonable suspicion, officer perception, and use of force justification. Final conclusion. Most traffic stop evaluations happen quietly, not dramatically. Officers are constantly testing behavior without announcing it. Testing timing, testing consistency, testing emotional control, testing movement patterns, testing whether words align with actions. And here's what most people never realize. These tests are often invisible to the driver while they are happening, but they become extremely visible later during bodycam review and courtroom analysis. This is why small moments matter so much. The first 10 seconds matter. Hands visibility matters. Seatbelt timing matters. Silence matters. Tone matters. Movement versus words. Again and again, because traffic stops are not simple conversations. They're evolving legal sequences. And once officer perception shifts, the legal framework shifts with it. Routine becomes investigative. Investigative becomes serious. Serious becomes custodial, often without the driver fully recognizing when the transition occurred. That's why awareness matters. Not confrontation, not fear, awareness. Because small moments decide big outcomes. If this breakdown helped you see traffic stops differently, subscribe and stay with this channel. More real-world legal analysis is coming. Calm, practical, and focus on how courts actually interpret these encounters long after the lights stop flashing.